Welcome back, everybody, for the second panel. And I would like to, for those that weren't with us in first panel, to give a welcome to our workshop, Security in Cyberspace. And for those who are joining from the previous panel, to welcome back with now the topic of the debate on liberty versus security, the future ahead. So the panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Jörg Pohle. So Dr. Jörg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having us here today, and welcome from me as well to the second panel. I want to start like the first panel to thank for the co-organizing institutions, that is the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, the Getulio Vargas Foundation, the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. And also many thanks to all the staff working in the back. As Bruna already introduced, in the second panel, we want to focus on one of the most pressing challenges in the governance of the Internet. That is the tension between security and liberty. In the age of the Internet, in the wake of the new challenges that arise from increased network connections, new data generation and collection methods, new analytical techniques, conflicting cultural values, and the emergence of the Internet as a critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, privacy, surveillance, and data protection debates have emerged as a prominent focal point for many reasons. They touch on the core values of our society, such as democracy, freedom, and fundamental rights, and the possibilities and limits of both technical infrastructure as well as regulatory attempts at different levels. These tensions between security and fundamental rights are nothing new. They are with us since at least the 1960s, when the first computers were networked, and they will most probably stay with us for the future. In this panel, we will focus on these tensions, and in particular on questions such as, how may security measures constrain human rights online? What can we do about that on the political level, in law, or with technical measures? How can we balance security interests of different actors, different stakeholders, and fundamental rights and freedoms? What role do public and private actors play? What about civil society? How could and should cooperation look like on a national, regional, or global level? What can we learn from existing approaches and practices, both in Europe and in Brazil? Without much further ado, I want to introduce the panelists of today. The first panelist is Marcelo Leal. He's a PhD student in political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a research assistant at the National Center for Digital Government. In his research, he explores global and national cybersecurity policies that states pursue to exercise power in cyberspace. The second panelist is Marília Maciel. She's a digital policy senior researcher at DiploFoundation, and she has been in the past working as a researcher. Oh no, don't share the slides. The first panelist is Marcelo, who will give a presentation. As a researcher and a coordinator at the Center for Technology and Society of the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Rio de Janeiro. But she also serves as a counselor at ICANN's generic names supporting organization, where she represents the non-commercial stakeholder group. And the last but not least of our panelists is Philipp Kühn. He's a doctoral student at the Chair for Science and Technology for Peace and Security in the Computer Science Department of the Technical University Darmstadt. His research covers, among others, privacy-enhancing technologies, and in his latest publication, he shed light on cyber threat intelligence sharing between states. We now start with the presentations. With Marcelo, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Jörg. I want to thank also Bruna and the organizing institutions for the invitation to participate in such an interesting debate. And on my initial remarks, I wanted to touch very quickly on three main points. I want to talk a little about the U.S. policies for security and liberty in cyberspace. Then talk a little about the main coalitions, advocacy coalitions behind these policies, and how they've been using the interdependence between U.S. and the European Union to advance some policies. So, U.S. policy is a complex patchwork of distinct legal frameworks and government entities that many times point to different directions. Part of this complexity is the result of overlaying regulations made at the local, state, and federal levels in the United States. This not only creates a fragmented legal framework, but it also creates many disputes between different levels of government, which is not unusual. Just to illustrate, recently, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE has been using facial recognition to identify illegal immigrants and has been using these techniques in driver's license databases that are owned by state localities. And of course, the states are not happy, or at least most of them are not happy with how ICE has been demanding to access the state databases, because many of these states, they pass laws that made it possible for illegal immigrants to issue driver's license. But even if we take the local and state regulations out of this from the equation, and look just the federal government, we still see a very fragmented framework. At the executive level, we have distinct departments and agencies focusing on different aspects of the debate and sending contradictory signs. Just look, for example, at the State Department, which has been for years promoting globalization in the internet, providing grants for activists to develop tech solutions in order to circumvent surveillance in authoritarian countries. And at the same time, you have the Department of Public Security, which has been doubling down on its capabilities to surveil international data. It's not uncommon in the U.S. that federal agencies engage in first battles to see their policy proposals being enacted at the federal level. And while some of these policies enhance security over cyber liberties in cyberspace, others go on the other direction. At the legislative side, Congress oversight is also divided among many different committees inside the House of Senate. We have the Judiciary Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, Homeland Security Committee, and these are just four of the main committees that, in some points, touch in cyber policies. They have partial jurisdiction over cybersecurity issues, and usually lack some coordination functions that would make possible for Congress to obtain a bird's eye view of cybersecurity and cyber privacy or cyber liberty in the United States. Congress also has this issue as a common rule in lawmakers see the descriptions from security and liberties in cyberspace as two different sets of laws. We have laws directed at government entities and laws directed at non-government entities. The first step basically deals with the relationship between government and citizens and companies. And we can include here laws of, for example, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, CISA, and government entities like the National Security Agency. And you have a second set of laws that deals with private-to-private relationships, which includes mainly regulations put forward by the Federal Trade Commission. Lawmakers also tend to divide when they are thinking about for cyberspace. Laws that are directed at U.S. citizens, laws that are directed to non-U.S. citizens. Usually, it's not a big thing for lawmakers to think about rights foreigners in the United States. You also have kind of a distinction between laws directed at national security and laws directed at. So this is a very broad view of the U.S. policies, the U.S. policy arena for cyberspace. This policy arena is pushed forward by mainly three major advocacy coalitions in the United States. The first one, and the one that most of us remember, is the Security Coalition. So this coalition is composed of intelligence and law enforcement communities, and its policies believe they are usually based on the idea of the security of the nation, which not necessarily goes hand in hand with individual security. So the intelligence agencies and the law enforcement agencies, they are not necessarily against civil liberties and right to privacy, for example, but they definitely value national security above all. Just take, for example, an opinion piece that was published last September on the New York Times by Glenn Gerstel. He's the general counsel of the National Security Agency. And Glenn Gerstel, he says in his opinion piece that he's in favor of safeguards in legislation to guarantee the right to privacy among Americans, for example. But clearly, the main message of his opinion piece is that we live in an era of persistent threat and that we need to take action to protect the nation. And to take action to protect the nation, national security agencies must have one of the main seats in the table in discussing it. This advocacy coalition gained a lot of power when after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and they were basically behind many of the laws and agencies that were created after 9/11 with them that enforced some security measures in exchange of some civil liberties. They were mainly able during the beginning of the 2000s to shield the discussions around security measures from privacy-oriented groups, and they guaranteed some at least tested collaboration of the business community. So you have on one side the security coalition, on the other side you have the privacy coalition. The privacy coalition is mainly composed by civil society groups in the United States. You have the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Center for Democracy and Technology, here's some examples. And their policy beliefs are based on the idea of that the protection of civil liberties is key to the security of individuals, and these at some times is at odds with the notion of national security advanced by law enforcement and intelligence communities. They take the backseat after 9/11, but they definitely gained some momentum after these notable revelations that basically showed how the policies pushed forward by the security communities were harvesting data from both U.S. and non-U.S. systems. It led to some policy reforms, as for example, the U.S. Freedom Act of 2015 in the United States. This reform, even if slightly the security-focused U.S. Patriot Act of 2001, but even the gridlock at the federal level and the partisanship and polarization at Congress, this coalition has moved a lot to work with local and state communities that are more open to the idea of promoting civil liberties. And finally, you have a third coalition, the business one. They are not necessarily worried about security or civil liberties, what they are trying to push is an unregulated market here in the United States, and as much as possible overseas. They have been mostly successful in their efforts, but they have suffered a lot of pushbacks since the 9/11. Even though they, in the 90s, they kind of won the crypto wars with the security community, they had to collaborate with the security community at 9/11. And after the digital regulations, they suffered a huge public relations problem and had to create mechanisms to regain the trust of users while avoiding pressure of the security community and enhance their encryption mechanisms. The recent data scandals, however, has once again put the members of this coalition centered front in the discussions about security and liberties in the United States. And they've been seeing some pushback, both of the privacy communities that are saying that data needs to be protected, but also from security communities that say that we need to have access to this data in order to protect the American democracy. All this gets a little more messy when we put the European Union also as an interdependent actor in this game. The 9/11 not only changed a lot of the policy arena in the United States, but also changed the policy arena in the European Union. And the attack created a sense of common transnational threat between the US and the European Union, which enhanced this idea of an internationalization of domestic security and increases the interdependence of national security policies between the United States and the European Union. Like in the US, Europe also needs to deal with security, privacy, and business coalitions that try to push policy proposals in different ways. But what is interesting is that some of these coalitions have been trying to use these transnational channels to advance their policies. During the 2000s, mainly the Security Coalition tries to use the transnational link between the US and the EU to advance its some of its security policies. But once again, with these notable revelations, the privacy community, mainly in Europe, finds the perfect opportunity to push back, since this privacy community has a harder time accessing these transnational channels, since they end up being mainly at the government level. So after these notable revelations, you have, for example, during the 2000s, you have the famous US-EU Safe Harbor Framework that basically regulated transfer of commercial data between the EU and the US. And with these regulations, you have the Friends case that basically kills the US-EU Safe Harbor Framework. The two regions come up with a new framework, the Privacy Shield, which technically strengthens some privacy protections. But the Privacy Shield also has been targeted of a new lawsuit against it in the European Union. And right now, it's unknown how long we will have Privacy Shield and how much we will need to come up with a new framework between these two regions. In the United States, the recent data scandals and election interference has pushed back both, as I said, the security and the privacy communities to try to push their proposals. The security community saying we need to access all the data, and the privacy community saying that we need to protect all the data. And definitely something that is helping on the debate is, for example, the recent approval in Europe of the GDPR, and how the privacy community is trying to change the underlying model of privacy regulation in the United States that was initially based a lot on consumer choice, the idea of notice and choice approach. I tell you the privacy guidelines, and you opt in or you opt out. and now has focused more on business behavior and handling data. In fact, just by the end of last year, 2 bills have been introduced at the Commerce Committee at the Senate, one by a Republican, another by a Democrat, that not only brings this consumer choice approach, but also puts a lot of regulations about business behavior and handling data. And I think we have now kind of a momentum to maybe advance the private legislation in the United States. So I think that's all for now, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. At least it's a good outlook. But now I want to give over to Marília. Marília, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to start by, of course, asking the classical question. Can you hear me well? Perfect. And
yes, we can.
Perfect, great. I'd like to thank the organizers and thank in particular Bruna de Alcântara for all the work that she put into the organization of this seminar. And thank all of you. I see that we have more than 100 participants connected to this session. So thank you very much for being here with us today. So this panel is about the dichotomy between security and liberty, and I would like to focus on the aspect of privacy. It's passing a little bit quickly. So there are two sentences that usually we hear a lot on the security versus privacy debate. The first one is that we must give up a little bit of our privacy if we want to achieve security. And the second one is that if we have nothing to hide, then we have nothing to fear. And what I find striking is that, first of all, this sentences, they are formulated by policymakers, so people in power, who have this kind of view that is either one or the other. And the second one is that this is framing all of the security versus privacy debate in which we find ourselves today. And what is interesting is that if we look at our national laws and if we look at the international system, the whole United Nations system for more than 70 years has been built upon 3 pillars that put on the same standing the need to protect peace and security, the need to observe human rights laws, and the need to promote development. And these 3 goals have been seen as connected, interdependent for more than 70 years. And right now, for the past years, what we see is that we have put emphasis in one of these pillars, peace and security, and we have left a little bit the other 2 pillars behind. And this is quite an unusual way of seeing things in the international system and in our national laws as well. So why are we at this stage in which we are giving so much prominence to security and skewing a little bit other values and fundamental freedoms such as privacy? The first reason is that cybersecurity is now part of everything that we do today as a society. Most of our activities and most of the infrastructures that are necessary for these activities to take place. So if you look at critical infrastructures such as power grids or the financial system or the way that we learn and study today, and the COVID-19 crisis comes to prove that, or if we think about our health, the internet and the digital technologies, they are underlying all of these activities and infrastructures. And this will become even more important and a problem when we think about the context of the Internet of Things and how the objects around us will be connected. Any flaw in this infrastructure can have threatening consequences, which can be not only economic, but also the cost of human lives. So this becomes really important to us. And also another reason is that instead of living in the context of cybersecurity, we find ourselves more and more in a context in which we have a situation of cyber insecurity. So there is a reason why we are in a context of cyber insecurity. And some of these reasons are, first of all, that we have a situation of multipolarity in cyberspace. if we look at geopolitics, and a lot of vehicles, magazines are talking about this bipolar situation in which the United States and China have technological prominence. But if we look at cyberspace and cyber capabilities, there is a large number of countries that claim to have capacity today to conduct a cyber attack. So cyber capabilities, they are much more widespread. They are not bipolar. We are in a multipolar world in which threats can come from different countries. The dissemination of technology happens not only among countries, but also among non-state actors, because the price of this technology has also come down a lot in recent years. So it's not just states that have access to technology, non-state actors such as terrorist groups have access as well. And the infrastructure of the internet is dual use by nature. So you have a mix of civilian and military use of digital networks. And because of that, things like human rights and humanitarian law concerns cannot be enacted thought after the fact. We need to put in place the right legal frameworks today. However, we are in a very initial state of seeing how international law applies to cyberspace. There is no doubt today that it does. The group of governmental experts in the UN has already said that international law applies to cyberspace. However, how it applies specifically, we are still trying to figure out. There are good initiatives on this regard, such as the publication of the Tallinn Manual, but these are not yet considered international law. Another point that brings us to the situation of insecurity is that we have witnessed with the case of the Stuxnet attack that a cyber attack may have consequences in the physical world. So you can destroy physical infrastructure with a computer malware, for instance, introduced in a system. So there is a breach between the cyber world and the physical world, which is quite concerning. And the last point is that there is a blurring line when it comes to military operations between the use of cyberspace as a theater of cyber attacks and the use of the physical space. And we had some very interesting examples recently in which Israel bombarded a physical building in which a hacker that attacked Israel supposedly was located. So a cyber attack motivated a physical attack. And we have the other example as well, in which Iran bombarded a US airplane and the US responded with a cyber attack against Iran. So this blurring of lines between physical operations, military operations taking place in the physical world and in the cyber world are quite concerning, because it could bring an escalation to tensions and to attacks very, very quickly. So we live in a process of securitization, and that summarizes what is going on quite well, I believe. I believe cybersecurity has moved from an issue that was not politicized, was not considered something relevant in the public debate. It has been politicized. So now we have doctrines, we have policies being put in place, and national strategies, and cyberspace has become a security issue, which means that it is a threat to the existence of states. It's a national threat, and because of that, states are allowed to employ all means necessary to make sure that cyberspace is secured for them. So this process of securitization as a theory, it underlines the changes that we have witnessed in recent years. When we think about cybersecurity and the protection of personal data, moving on to the personal data side now, we see that over the years, these two areas have not been completely separated. Information security has inspired a lot of the processes that we now use in the field of personal data protection when it comes, for instance, to the use of methodologies for risk assessment, or the practices that should be observed by data controllers, by data processors. So these two fields, they have been in communication for quite some time, and they have been in proficuous and useful dialogue. However, if we look at specific fields such as the fighting of cybercrime, or the intelligence gathering, or the field of national security, or the protection against terrorism, more and more security is being framed in a way that is security versus privacy. And the word balance has appeared a lot in a recent discourse, especially in the media. There's a need to balance privacy and security. But when we talk about putting things in a balance, unnecessarily, it means that we are giving more weight to something in detriment of something else. And this is quite concerning when we think about the ultimate goal that society should have, which is to protect security and privacy at the same time. And that word balance explains what lies behind sentences such as the one we saw in the beginning. We must be willing to give up some privacy if it makes us more secure. There are two competing narratives very clearly now on the debate of privacy versus security. One of them comes from law enforcement and security agencies that say that criminals are going dark. So criminals are using technologies such as encryption, they are populating the dark web, and they are using these spaces and these technologies to be out of the reach of law enforcement and criminal agencies in general. And they are winning this war, therefore law enforcement needs to have augmented powers to be able to fight them, to prosecute them, to find them. However, the other competing narrative that we see very strongly is that actually these powers have already been given not only to security agents, but also to private actors who have been collecting more information than ever before about every move and transaction and communication that happens online. So if we look at private actors, they have received more requests from governments to disclose information about their users than ever before. If we look at the Snowden revelations, like were mentioned before, we learned how many of these private actors have been collaborating with the governmental agencies and sharing personal information. A lot of the personal data, including sensitive data such as biometric data, has been collected by governments as well. And we have seen that an infrastructure of surveillance is present not only in non-democratic societies, but also in democratic ones. And this is an example from Brazil after what we call the mega events, such as the Olympics and the World Cup. A whole infrastructure of cameras and security has been put in place in the country. And of course, after the events, this infrastructure is repurposed for law enforcement goals. So there are many news that say that now we have biometric data collected worldwide, and the situation that we live with the COVID-19 is actually naturalizing data collection, including facial recognition technologies worldwide. We have seen that it has been used by many countries, and even countries that have strong frameworks of data protection, such as France. They look with admiration into countries that have utilized personal information to track the spread of the virus. So we have many examples of laws and bills that have been approved in democratic countries, countries with fully functioning institutions such as the UK, and I'm going to pass very quickly because of the time. In Germany as well, in France, laws have been approved. They have been struck down by courts. However, they always come back when a new event takes place, such as a terrorist attack. So there are analysts that say that even in Europe, we are living in an unprecedented age of the return of mass surveillance with subreptitious provisions that are included in these laws with the aim to fight crime and to fight terrorism. Of course, there is a lot of emphasis on how privacy is being protected with laws such as the data protection regulation, but these laws, they are targeted at private companies. In Europe, for instance, the data protection package includes not only the GDPR, but it has also a directive which aims to protect individuals in the course of criminal investigations. And this law is a directive, and it has not been transposed into national law by some countries, such as Spain and Greece. So we see that there is a double standard there are standards that are being observed with regards to private actors, but when it comes to the public actors, not so much. And of course, there are concerning situations in countries such as China, and we live in a situation of the all or nothing fallacy. And with that, I think I will bring to a close and perhaps explore the specific situation in Latin America in the questions. So this fallacy is that we need to give away our privacy on behalf of protecting security, but we need to be aware that not all security measures are invasive of also privacy. And protecting our privacy seldom negates security measures altogether. There are measures that can be put in place that are protective of privacy, and among all the tools that law enforcement have in front of them, they always need to choose the one that is less invasive of privacy. So the question is usually framed in a way that, you know, should governments be allowed to read emails and to listen to phone calls to fight terrorism? And people would say, oh, yes, because they need to fight terrorism. But however, the question should be framed as, should governments be allowed to read emails and to listen to phone calls without observing due process? And then it's a different question. If they do observe all the safeguards and they tailor the measures to the case in which they are actually needed, then it's a different story. And we will try in this way to make sure that we observe both security and privacy. However, this is not what is going on in most countries around the world. Here in Europe, it's not an exception, and in Latin America, it's not an exception either. But I will explore Latin America perhaps in the question and answer phase. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marília. Now we come to the last panelist and the last presentation. I'm sorry, the slides are back on the screen. Okay. Philipp Kühn.
Can you hear me all?
Yes.
And can you see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. So hi, my name is Philipp Kühn, and I'm going to talk about the crypto wars and surveillance and its implications for liberty. So I work for PSEC, which is short for Science and Technology for Peace and Security at the TU Darmstadt. And my research topics are information technology for peace and security, and more specifically, cyber war and cyber peace. We published some research book about these topics. One is information technology for peace and security, and one is secure human-computer interaction. And this brings me to my topic. First, I will touch the topic human rights and cryptography. Human rights, so liberty and privacy are human rights, and the cyberspace is insecure by design. This is a very toxic mixture because in the early days, our communication took place in private more often, and in the cyberspace, this is not true anymore because all our communication are routed over third parties, for example, the internet service providers. And encryption now enables us private communications again by applying end-to-end encryption to our communication. I will explain this later, very short. So, encryption protects individuals of censorship because no one can look into the individual communication or communication content. So the rights are written down or declared in several declarations. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this brings me to cryptography. Cryptography, short crypto, is used to mathematically ensure confidentiality of information. Historically, it is used solely by the military. For example, the Emperor Caesar had an encryption cipher, which he used to communicate with his troops, and nobody else could look into this communication if they did not have the key. And in the World War II, there was the Enigma machine, which was used for the same purpose. And for this reason, during the Cold War, cryptography algorithm were added to the U.S. ammunitions list. basically banning the export of crypto algorithms out of the US. And if they are exported, they must have been licensed by the US State Department and weakened by magnitude so that the NSA, for example, could still look into the communication. And the availability of the PC and the development of the World Wide Web urged the need for encryption because now companies store their data digitally, and at the same time period, the US spied on several human rights activists. Just to give the background about the crypto wars when the crypto wars started. So cryptography in general, how it works. For example, Alice and Bob want to communicate with each other. Alice writes a message, encrypts it with an encryption key, and sends it over an untrusted channel to Bob. Bob then decrypts this message either with the same key or another key. This depends on the encryption algorithm, and can look into the message again. And on the way between them, there is nobody who can look into these messages. In end-to-end encryption, this is the encryption happens on Alice's device and Bob's device, the decryption happens, and there are different encryption methods. For example, transport encryption, where only the transportation of data is encrypted, and on the server, this is not the case. So the server side could look into the messages. And this brings me to the topic of crypto wars. First, I give a short definition, as well as it could be defined, and then I look into the development of the crypto wars over time. So the crypto war is no official term. It is coined by civil rights activists, and it want to show the conflict between human rights activists or tech companies and intelligence services. It is following the technological development. And yeah, so it started with the emergence of the World Wide Web and ended, and it's still ongoing. So I'll pick some incidents in the crypto wars. These are not all of them. And I will start with the development of the encryption device called TSD3600. This device was used to encrypt telephony communication between two devices, and the State Department was not very happy about this situation because this device enabled users to encrypt their telephone communication so that the NSA or State Departments could not log into it. So they made an offer to AT&T to introduce to replace the original encryption chip with a state-owned or state-developed Clipper chip. And said, if you do this, then we buy a lot of these devices. And because the TSD3600 was not very successful at this time, AT&T accepted the offer. The only drawback with this Clipper chip was that the Clipper chip had a key escrow functionality. So the State Departments or law enforcement had a decryption key and could always look into the communication of the TSD3600 devices. And I want to compare this with another project which happened in the second stage of the crypto war. So one can define two different stages in the crypto war. I will come to that later. With the leakage of the NSA documents by Edward Snowden. So we already heard that the NSA runs several programs, for example, PRISM and XKeyscore, downloading all information that's or collecting all information that is running through the internet. And one particular program is called Bull Run. In this program, the goal of this program was to include vulnerabilities or insert vulnerabilities in common encryption algorithms. So the NSA could look into the communication secretly. And if we compare the first crypto war and the second crypto war, the first crypto war is about selective wiretapping. So the NSA wanted to have the ability to collect data if they needed to. And the second crypto war is about arbitrary mass surveillance, so basically hacking and exploiting devices. And there were secret contracts between tech companies and the NSA so that the NSA could look into all communication happening on their infrastructure. And now I want to look deeper into the connection of the AT&T, the Clipper chip, and the Bull Run program. So the Clipper chip program started in 1993 and was publicly announced in 1993, so that there was no difference. And in the Bull Run program, there was a pretty big difference. So it started in the 2000s, and it was only made public because of the NSA document leakages. And the targets are also different. So the Clipper chip program was targeted at the US citizens, and the Bull Run program is targeted at the whole globe because they break and manipulate common crypto algorithms which are used all over the globe. And in difference, the goal of the Clipper chip program was this key escrow functionality in chips to be used. The data protection in the Clipper chip program is it was a split backdoor between different organizations, which was only accessible with a warrant. And for Bull Run, there's no data protection, and the profiteer is solely the NSA, whereas at the Clipper chip program, there's the whole law enforcement agencies are the profiteers. And for the transparency, as I already stated, in the Clipper chip program, there was a public notice of this practice, but nobody said how it's working. And in the Bull Run program, this was secret until the NSA document leakages. So there we can also see the difference in how the whole programs are working. So the difference between the first crypto war and the second crypto war. This brings me to the topics of surveillance in general and the data retention in Europe. So data retention is Vorratsdatenspeicherung in German. So arbitrary mass surveillance is definitely no solution because it's an unlawful approach. The European Court of Justice declared data retention unlawful because it's violating the presumption of innocence. And Europe has a history in data retention since 2006, when a guideline was announced which touched this topic, and later was resigned in 2014 because of the unlawfulness of this approach. And in Austria, since 2018, there's an approach program called Quick Freeze, which is far less invasive than surveillance because it's storing communication metadata in only in suspected cases. So the law enforcement must notify the ISPs or telecommunication providers that they want to investigate a suspect, and the telecommunication providers then stop deleting all the temporary data about the suspected case, which basically, and then they can get the data only with a warrant, which basically prevents ex-ante observations, so observation of data before the time of notification. And this is basically so it's basically comparable with the individual wiretapping of the first crypto war. And so we see there are different adjustable parameters which can be touched to improve the situation of surveillance or data retention, which are, for example, who to surveil or what information are stored of the suspected cases and who has access to the data and when do they have access to the data. And the storage time is a very important point of security because data breaches are happening all over the time. And there must be according protection measures of the stored data. So this brings me to my conclusion. So there is no, so there's an increasing uncontrolled surveillance because there are no borders in cyberspace. So, for example, the NSA are looking just over the globe to get the information. Big data is rising, and also so are the computing capabilities. And we have an increasing data emission, for example, using IoT devices or wearables. Cryptography is able to protect our data and has widely been implemented by tech companies. For example, WhatsApp is using encryption in their communication now. But this encryption alone cannot help us in this situation, which can be seen in the case of the NSA surveillance programs. So there must be a discussion of data handling by intelligence services. Because they are basically, in the current stage, they are basically violating the privacy and presumption of innocence. And law enforcement needs to use data transparently and intrinsically controllable and criticizable. So there are a few defensive measures which can be done on the individual or global level. So on the individual level, there must be individual privacy protection measures. For example, the very simple measure, think twice what you put on the internet. And there are, on the global level, there must be strong data protection regulations. For example, the European GDPR, which have always also been touched by Marília. There are also the adjustable parameters, which I already mentioned. So thanks for your attention, and yeah, that's for my talk.
Thank you very much for all the presentations. Really food for thought, and I've seen the messages coming up in the Q&A, and lots of questions. Before we go to the discussion of the questions, I would like to introduce the first call. I hope this is working now. Yeah. What kind of institution could better develop a balance between security and fundamental rights and freedoms in cyberspace? That's not the question of panel 2. Actually, it is the second question of panel 2. Someone has changed the order. Okay, then we take the second question of panel 2 as the first question in the poll. In your opinion, what is the main problem that refrains the development of confidence-building measures? A lack of transparency among states, a lack of dialogue between states and the private sector, maybe also civil society, a lack of political motivation, or a lack of economical. Okay, now disappeared again. A lack of economical motivation. And then the question, yeah, all of the above. Okay, while you are able to answer that following question, we will come back to the panel and the questions in this. First of all, I find it intriguing, and Philipp has also noted this, that historically civilians, especially those without any relation to some government or some other important institution, that they were of no interest for intelligence agencies and operations, state operations in spying on civilians. That has fundamentally changed, especially with the means of mass surveillance available now to intelligence agencies. And that brings us to the question that is, I think, directly at one of the main challenges today. Should states treat in their laws and in their practices their own citizens and foreign citizens differently or not? So I would give it to the panel. We know that in the American debate, it's very much standard to treat them differently. Protection is provided for their own citizens, and legal the people that are lawfully in the United States, but not to foreigners. But especially in Europe, there has been a development in the last couple of years where at least the debate has changed quite a bit. What do we think about that? Marcelo, you want to start?
Well, as you were mentioning, here in the US, there's this clear division, and lawmakers, they don't really care because American citizens don't really care that much about protection to foreigners, so these don't get votes in the election time. But as a foreigner, even though I'm lawfully living in the country, I always think that it's many ways to talk about that. I think it's Marília who we have these blurring lines about between domestic and international citizens and non-citizens, and I think it's important for every government to consider that cyberspace presents a global problem, and we need to solve it in a more global form than just trying to push nationalistic and citizen-focused policies forward.
Thank you. Marília?
I think that fundamentally, if we think about human rights, they are indivisible and they need to be observed as a characteristic that is inherent to the human condition. As an individual, I think it's really difficult to sustain the idea that you respect the human rights of your own citizens, but not of foreign citizens. However, on the international scenario, considering how much countries collect information, especially the countries that have sort of a leeway on the infrastructure that runs the internet. I'm thinking about the United States and the fact that many of the companies that hold a large part of our personal data is located in the US territory. They have their headquarters in the US, and that, of course, we would be naive to think that this does not give a country such as the US some leeway over the operation of these countries and some possibility to put political pressure and have access to information. I think the more people become aware, and the Snowden revelations did a lot for people to become more aware, it becomes a point of not only honor, but also of business interest for these companies to resist the pressure. And we must see the resistance that Apple had to give the information to the US authorities. Under this framework, I think companies are starting to resist more because it's about proving to their users that they have the capacity to resist governmental pressure. However, still, I think it's hard to believe that a country that hosts a company that holds a lot of information will never try to exert political pressure over these companies. And it's not only the US. I think other countries as well, even if they are democratic, they would be highly tempted to put this pressure in cases that are highly relevant from a national security standpoint mainly, but as an individual, as an academic, and as a human being, I think that it's not sustainable, ethically speaking, morally speaking, to say that human rights shouldn't be respected no matter what the nationality of the individual.
So I can only agree with Marília, because in my opinion, in cyberspace, humans are indifferently. So in cyberspace, one is just bits and bytes, and no one can distinguish between bits and bytes and what nationality these bits and bytes have. So I can just agree with her in this. Yeah.
Thank you. That leads us to the second question, that is the role of private companies in this. We've seen the discussion a couple of times in the last years. For example, regarding the well-known case with the Apple phone in San Bernardino in California. The question whether private companies either build IT systems or smartphones or technology in general, or operators. So service providers that on the one side, they have an interest to protect their customers. So they try to defend their customers with regards to state infringements on their fundamental rights. On the other side, they have their own interest in collecting data, lots of data about the customers, how they behave, in order to exploit that information for their own business interests. So are they good players in this game if we talk about the relationship between security and privacy, or security and fundamental rights, that we would look for private actors like private companies, private businesses as a kind of possible coalition partner for defending rights, or as a kind of possible coalition partner of the state, just on a different side, because they want to keep up their businesses, and they're not on the side of not necessarily on the side of supporting the state. So what do you think, what is the relationship between these actors, and how should we treat them when they come together and negotiate the rules of the internet? Marcelo, you want to start again?
Thank you. I can talk a little about the case here in the US, where the companies have aligned many times with privacy needs. But for example, there is some concern of privacy needs in the United States about passing general federal privacy law. And that's because they think that tech companies will be able to lobby more easily in Washington, which has a weak privacy law than the privacy laws that we have on the state. And that, for example, is one of the contingents on the two privacy laws that we have now on the Senate, because one of them says that all state regulations will be preempted once the federal law is enacted, and the other says that the state laws cannot contradict the federal law, but if they are stronger, they have more strict measures, good for them. And I've seen, for example, the Electronic Frontier Commission kind of sometimes pushing back against the idea of the federal law, because they think that this federal law, after all the discussions and all the lobbying, will be a weak one. So I think we can take companies as volunteer members in private communities, but I think we need to be also alert, because they have their own agenda.
Thank you. Marília, Philipp, do you want to add something?
I can go on if you want to. So the situation of the private companies is a split one, I think. So in the early days, Google, for example, was driven by the free access to the internet idea, and after they entered the stock market, had their own ideas. So they wanted to make profit, and now if you look at the data surveillance introduced by Google, for example, and analytics, for example, in the YouTube recommendations, which is a very simple example, but wants us to keep us on YouTube as long as possible, so we can watch as much ads as possible to make more profit. Another example is Facebook, which has this enormous ad system. And then we have, for example, companies like Clearview AI, which was in the news in this early year. So which basically is a facial recognition company using billions of portraits collected in the open web, and basically scratching at the same conflict, security versus privacy or liberty. So there's a split situation with the private companies, and this must be taken into consideration as well, I think.
If I can jump in very quickly, we can never forget that collecting data and using this data, sharing this data with third parties and using this data to correlate information is the business models for most internet companies. So they're making money out of the data that we share with them. Therefore, I think it's unrealistic to expect that them as gatekeepers of this information will be completely protective of our personal data. When I was working in FGV, we conducted a study. We analyzed the terms of service of 50 major platforms that we use in our everyday, and it was quite shocking to see that the terms of service of most of these platforms are quite non-respective of rights such as privacy, freedom of expression, and due process. These were the 3 human rights that we looked into. So it was for us unexpected, but the extent to which these rights were disregarded were quite shocking to us. So now the study is 6 years old, but I don't think much changed on this scenario. And in fact, I think that these companies regulate our rights through terms of service many times much more than states do, because they can change terms of service unilaterally. And if we don't accept the change, then we are not part of the platform. And for many people, it's impossible not to be part of these platforms today.
Mm-hmm. Does that basically mean, we especially you, Marília, you talked about the rule of law quite strongly in your presentation. Does that actually mean, both regarding states and regarding private companies, that the smaller they are and the less they control regarding states, if they don't control access nodes or big network sections, or like the hardware or software market, and regarding companies, if they don't control monopolies in the internet, then they are not this dangerous or risky, at least. So actually, it's not kind of a difference between states or private companies, but it's more like between powerful entities, both in private and public space, and between the less powerful entities. And the less powerful entities, both in states and the private sector, is less threatening to the fundamental rights and the freedoms on the internet than the more powerful ones. So maybe the coalitions are actually kind of wrong. And then the question would be how to get better coalition. Who should come up with the coalition which players do you think should come together to solve this riddle and this struggle between liberty and security, especially state security or national security on the internet? Who should come together and form a coalition? What do you think? What are the actors you want to see in there?
So I think some coalitions are already forming. If we look at the international scenario, the Freedom Online Coalition is an important group of countries and non-governmental actors that came together some years ago with the aim to make sure that fundamental rights are protected in cyberspace. They did publish a lot of documents that offer guiding principles when it comes to cybersecurity, freedom of expression. The thing with the international scenario is that it is very hard to approve international law on cyber issues today. Russia just proposed in the UN that countries start a process of negotiation to have a cybersecurity treaty that would cover the globe. Now we have the Budapest Convention from the Council of Europe that covers a large number of European and non-European countries, but we don't have a global convention. But what many people say is that we are in a scenario that there are so stark divisions of views when it comes to handling and regulating cyberspace that it will be hard to bring everyone together. Therefore, I believe that these non-governmental coalitions or mixed coalitions that aim to produce not only international law, but that focus on norms, they are more important than we think. One of these groups was the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. That was also a multi-stakeholder effort that just published its report last year, in the end of last year. We proposed several norms when it comes to guaranteeing the stability of cyberspace. It's a very interesting report, and the norms start to give the different actors, governmental and non-governmental actors, a focal point around which they can converge. So the importance of norms, even if they are non-binding when it comes to cybersecurity on the international level, is very important. And we cannot forget that international law abides states, but does not apply directly to companies, for instance. And if they control a large part of the infrastructure and the data, then we are talking about norms, not necessarily treaties that will make them observe certain kinds of standards that we want them to observe, such as fundamental rights.
Thank you. I would like to call the next call and I hope Bruna in the back and Gianni, that the next call is hopefully now. What kind of institutions could better develop a balance between security and fundamental rights and freedoms in cyberspace? Public institutions, private institutions, mixed, that is public-private partnerships. No institution could be able to provide this balance, or I prefer not to answer. Okay, and then we come to sample of last questions from the audience. The first one is looking at the hardware sector, because much of the hardware development and production is controlled by basically two different countries. And the question is, conflicts between US and Chinese companies showed how vulnerable it could be in terms of hardware insecurity. How do the panelists evaluate our security level with regards to hardware solutions? Maybe Philipp, you want to start. You're a security engineer by training.
So from the IT security perspective, we have the problem that we have a supply chain, which is basically which solely leads to the Chinese, and we need to trust the Chinese that they are doing hardware-wise what we want them to do. So they are shipping the products we are ordering. And so we need to trust the supply chain in general. And yeah, that's from the IT perspective, IT security perspective, the current situation. Yeah, I think I cannot add any further information to this.
At least some of the countries, including the United States, are discussing to kind of get back the ability to produce hardware. Also in Europe, this discussion has been being framed as sovereignty, which is a sovereignty issue. So, Marcelo, what do you think? Have you looked at this debate in the United States that is going on now?
Yeah, so I think there is a policymakers here pushing, and not only here, I think that also in Europe and other countries, to kind of this nationalization of global supply chains, in part because some of the supply chains have been weaponized, in part by the United States, and the US has used its hierarchical network to use mainly economic networks to get some security advantages at the global level. What I think is more interesting about the debate of the supply chain that is not happening here. I'm not sure if it's happening in Europe. Is how the global south is going to respond, because I always, as a Brazilian, I always think that yes, China has a lot of issues of accountability, but so far the news that we had is that the US was deeply spying on us, including the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, at the time. So sometimes it feels that it's just trying to choose who will spy on us, not who we will trust to not spy on us in the future. But I don't see that debate happening here. At least from the American side, it seems so obvious to policymakers here that China is a threat, that everybody that's not seeing this, even if it's a small country like Uruguay, like.
That reminds me that actually after the Snowden revelations, it was Brazil and Germany together who introduced the resolution shortly after the Snowden revelations in late 2013 to the United Nations General Assembly on the right to privacy in the digital age. And that was somehow maybe the starting point for these cooperating, these institutions are now cooperating here in this workshop also. Yeah, thank you. I think we can have a last question from the audience. That question is a bit broader, and I would even broaden that question a bit more. The question was, do we need a crisis for the cybersecurity regulation policy policy landscape to develop further? If so, and with COVID-19 in mind, in which direction are we heading? So generally, especially the presentation by Philipp has shown that kind of the pendulum was at times swinging back and forth. So there were the Snowden revelations actually took a huge move towards, at least in the debate, towards privacy, data protection, fundamental rights on the internet, also regarding legislation. So do we need a crisis? Do we always need a crisis to get things better regulated than before? And if yes, or if no, what do you think? what does the future look like in this field? So I just want to give all of you, the possibility to kind of sum up something. If you want to start, Marcelo.
So, well, from a policy perspective, I do not think that we need necessarily a crisis to see policy change, not crisis. However, policy crisis, the national crisis, the domestic crisis, they definitely create some windows of opportunities for policy entrepreneurs to put forward their policy proposals. That happened with the 9/11, where the security community, Security Advocacy Coalition, tried to push hard their proposals. It happened with the Snowden crisis. It's happening once again with the recent data scandals involving Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, with some meddling in U.S. elections. So regarding the COVID-19, definitely each coalition is trying once again to push its preferred policy proposal. The security community probably is trying to push the contact tracing, hoping that we'll be able to leverage that in the future. Private groups are saying that we shouldn't go too fast with that, and I'm not sure which side will win. I think it will depend a lot on the narrative behind it, and we can already see the narrative moving from initially everybody was talking about contact tracing apps, and there are some polls showing that 1 in 5 Americans said they would use the contact tracing app because they do not trust Google and Apple, that here in the United States are the leading companies working on that. But other polls, they changed it. Instead of calling contact tracing apps, they call it infectious something app, and you have a higher percentage of people saying, yeah, they would use. And the percentage goes even up, and you're still arresting some policymakers, like entrepreneurs, to push the idea of how they call the kind of the going back to complement apps. So the idea is that we're not tracing you. We are putting some tech solutions so people can have free movement and everybody stays safe of being quarantined. That, well, yeah, they're just, if I can go to school, if I can go to work, why not? And I think how the narrative will be framed will define a lot of information.
Thank you. Marília.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Marcelo that we do not necessarily need crisis to have a change in policy. However, crises do serve as a catalyst, and we saw in Brazil with the approval of the civil rights framework, Marco Civil, that was in the drawer for so many years. It took the Snowden revelations for Marco Civil to finally be put to vote in Congress and be approved. So sometimes we do need a crisis to push the situation forward. However, the result, if it's a positive or negative from the standpoint of human rights and fundamental freedoms, this is not at all clear to me. What I see with crises such as COVID-19 is that the more securitization advances and the more there's an atmosphere of fear among people, and fear from many things, from terrorist attacks, from disease, from the invasion of countries by immigrants. There are so many ghosts out there. The more people feel afraid, and many times these fears, they are not at all rational. They are just based on a certain feeling. The more we are opening doors for this balance to be skewed towards security. And it's very important, in my opinion, that we work more with law enforcement, because sometimes in the human rights debate, we treat them as the ones just want to grab information, but they have a purpose and they sometimes have a goal that is very honorable. They want to have information to be able to do their job. However, many times they have not been exposed to many of the discussions that take place in the human rights circles. So one of the important things that I think we should do is to provide training for law enforcement to problematize more the debate of law enforcement from a human rights standpoint, to try to find the tools that are less invasive from a privacy standpoint, so they can perform their job invading privacy less. However, what I think is more difficult to put in reins is the private sector. Our governments, if we have democratic societies and functioning institutions, we have some mechanisms to put them back in place and to put them in check. However, with private companies, it's really difficult to do so. And the more we move towards collection of data, artificial intelligence, the more manipulation of our behavior becomes subreptitious. And if we don't know what's going on, it's very hard to question the status quo. Therefore, I think that this movement needs to encompass the private sector too. Here, it's a session on security. We focused on government and law enforcement, and it's natural that we did so. However, I think the debate needs to encompass the private sector and how to keep them in check as well.
Thank you very much. Philipp.
So I can agree, Marília, that crises are indeed catalysts to the whole debate. And so I touched in my talk the parameters of surveillance. So there must be a big part of the transparency, how surveillance happens, and what parts are surveilled, or even if it's surveilled or not. So maybe it's just and look into the data in a suspected case, like it's done in Austria with the quick freeze program. So I think transparency here is the key point. And so if the law enforcement or other organizations are not transparent enough, the privacy could be undermined again, like it has been done, or it's probably been done or ongoing by the NSA. So yeah, that's my opinion on this.
Thank you very much. Then I see you all nodding on the transparency and the call for transparency. Yeah, maybe that's one of the first steps in finding a balance between competing interests, including security in its different shapes, that is IT security, cyber security, national security, also including then law enforcement and fundamental rights and freedoms, including democracy, privacy, as well as maybe freedom of speech. We haven't talked about this, but transparency might be the most important enabler for at least being able to challenge decisions by states, by private actors regarding the balancing between the two, and being able to go to court in cases that they have not met the expectations and the legal requirements for doing their job and protect both security and freedoms on the internet as well as off the internet. Thank you very much for this tremendous discussion on this panel. And yeah, hope to see you soon somewhere else. And thank you very much again. And now back to Bruna.
Thank you very much, Jörg, and thank you all the panelists. We now enter in the new break section. I hope to see you again in a few minutes for our next panel. And I just wanted to give you an announcement. The Q&A has a limit of characters, so please try to make your questions a little bit shorter or within the limit of 256 characters. So thank you very much, and see you in a minute.